This keyboard right here has some of the best sounding creamy pops I've ever heard, and it cost around $230 to build, and I'm going to show you step by step how to build it. But before that, this is what the final build sounds like. This video is not sponsored by AKKO, nor did they send me this board. Alright, here's what you need for this build. First is the kit. For this, we're going to use this AKKO ACR Pro 75 kit. The kit comes in a bare bones version and a pre-assembled version. When I first bought this board, the kit was out of stock, so I had to settle for the pre-assembled version. The only difference between the two is the slight price difference, and the kit comes with an extra aluminum plate, which the pre-assembled doesn't, and the pre-assembled also comes with an extra set of keycaps and switches. However, for this build, you will not need that extra aluminum plate, just the polycarbonate one. Alright, to get the exact same sound as me, you're going to need to get these KTT Halu switches, which are also lubed with 205G0. Lubing will take an extra 2 to 3 hours, but if you're not willing to do this, there are some factory lubed alternatives. My two favorite factory lubed alternatives are first the Oil King and then the Banana Splits. Here's what the sound difference is between those and the switches I used. Not all pre-lubed switches are as good as these, but these are just the best ones I found. And factory lube was never going to beat hand lube switches, so I still recommend hand lubing your switches. Now back to the Halu switches. For lubing your switches, you will of course need your lube, a small thin brush, a switch opener, and a stem holder. These are all pretty cheap on Amazon, and you can sometimes find the switch opener, brush, and stem holder all in a bundle. Now this is optional, but having a lubing station is nice, but it's definitely not necessary. Next is stabilizers. Now for the build in this video, I used Durock V2 stabilizers, but this did call for me needing a Dremmel part of the polycarbonate plate for them to fit, and not everybody has a Dremmel. So some good plate mount alternatives are Drop Phantoms and Everglides. Lastly, if you don't want to spend money on stabs, the ones in the board are okay, but they definitely need some extra lube. Along with your stabilizer of choice, make sure you have some 205G0 lube, a fabric bandaid, a small brush, and some small needlehead tweezers or anything small and thin that fits in the stabilizer stem hole. Now to finish things off, you'll need a regular Phillips head screwdriver and a roll of painter's tape. Yes, this does have to be painter's tape. We will be using the tape for the tape mod, and if you use the wrong type of tape, you're not going to be able to get it off without having a lot of residue, or it could short circuit the PCB. Now depending on the type of kit you bought, you may or may not need keycaps for this board. Here's a master list of everything you'll need. Remember that you may or may not need certain parts depending on what you choose. Okay, now to get started on the build. The first thing we're going to do is lube our switches and tune our stabilizers. Now, because there's already a ton of amazing tutorials out there on how to do both these mods, I'm not really going to go that in depth. I'll be linking the videos for all the switches and stabilizer mods in the description, but just for reference, here's quickly how I lube my switches. I use a pretty generous amount of lube and start with the bottom housing, dapping both the sides, then lubing the center. After that, I'll go back to the sides and spread it out. I bag lube all my springs, then I lube the entire outside stem, making sure you get the bottom at the end. For stabilizers, I first start by holy modding the stems with the fabric bandaid. This is where you're going to need that small thin needle tool. I then lube the housing and insert the stem. Lastly, I wire balance and then lube the outside of the wire and assemble it all together. Now that the switches and stabs are ready, we're going to get the board ready. If you got the pre-assembled version, this is when you'll need to take out all the switches and keycaps. There should be some tools inside your kit for that. Carefully open up the keyboard, making sure you disconnect the wire that connects the case to the PCB. From here, we're going to put the stabilizers in. If you're not using the plate mount stabilizers, then you can skip this step. Unscrew all the screws from the plate to separate the PCB and plate. Next, you can remove the old stabilizers. From here, we can screw in our new Durock V2 stabilizers. Make sure that the screw hole goes towards the small hole on the keyboard. And if your stabilizer kit came with these little rings, they go with the screws. I also like to loosen the screws just a tiny amount to make sure they're not just cemented in place. With all the stabs in place, you can then Dremel the plate until the plate can easily fit with the new stabilizers. There shouldn't be any friction between the two. Also make sure not to Dremel the place where the switch fits into the plate, because then it might ruin the way the switch mounts. Once you're done with this, then you can assemble some test stabs and keycaps to make sure everything is working correctly. If done correctly, everything should be pretty free and not have too much resistance. If there is still resistance, you might need to take it back apart and smoothen some of the sides some more. But once they're all good, then you can reassemble the PCB and plate. Make sure you also put the foam that came in between the PCB and plate back inside. Lastly, before we put the switches on, we need to do the tape mod. This is a pretty easy step, just layer the tape across the back of the PCB, making sure it's all pressed down. Do this until you have 3 layers of tape, and then cut out some holes for the cable and USB thing. Before we reassemble the keyboard, make sure you get that extra piece of foam that came with the kit and put it inside the case. After this, we can reattach the cable and screw the board back together. Now it's time to put the switches in, and make sure you line the switches up correctly to not bend any pins. The switches should fit in pretty easily, and if you have to force them down too much, you probably bent the pin. But if you do bend some pins, it's not that big of a deal, you can straighten them back out with some pliers. After all the switches, slap on the new keycaps, and bam, you got your brand new keyboard. Now you should probably test the keyboard in a keyboard testing software just to make sure all the keys work correctly. If they don't, then they probably have bent pins and you can just take them out and fix them. Thanks for watching, and comment any questions or concerns down below, and see you later.